When we begin to examine the rise of what people are calling the Get Out of America movement, we have to resist the temptation to treat it as something sudden or isolated. Movements like this don't just appear overnight. They are symptoms. They are reflections of deeper anxieties, frustrations, and shifts in collective psychology. What we are witnessing is not simply a call to leave a country. It is an emotional reaction to a perceived loss of stability, identity, and control. Over the past decade, the average individual has been exposed to an unprecedented volume of information. Social media has created a world where comparison is constant. You are no longer comparing your life to your neighbor or your colleague. You are comparing it to curated highlights of people living in completely different systems, cultures, and economic realities. And slowly, without realizing it, dissatisfaction begins to grow. Not necessarily because your life has become objectively worse, but because your perception of what it should be has dramatically shifted. At the same time, there have been very real pressures building within American society. Economic uncertainty, rising costs of living, healthcare concerns, and political polarization have all contributed to a sense of instability. People feel like the ground beneath them is no longer as firm as it once was. And when human beings feel instability, they instinctively look for escape. This is not new. It is deeply rooted in human psychology. When the environment feels threatening or limiting, the mind begins to imagine alternatives. But here's where it becomes more complex. The idea of getting out is often less about geography and more about relief. It's about the belief that somewhere else, life will be simpler, fairer, or more meaningful. And that belief is powerful. It spreads quickly, especially in digital spaces where narratives are amplified without context. A single video of someone claiming they found peace abroad can spark thousands of others to question their own reality. However, we must ask, is this movement built on consistent truth or selective storytelling? Because what often goes unnoticed is that dissatisfaction travels with you. If the root of your frustration is internal, your expectations, your mindset, your inability to cope with uncertainty, then changing your location will not eliminate that struggle. It will only reshape it. There is also a subtle but important shift happening in how people define success and fulfillment. Previous generations were more willing to endure hardship in pursuit of long-term stability. Today, there is a growing desire for immediate alignment. People want their environment to match their emotional and psychological needs right now. And when it doesn't, the solution increasingly becomes leave. So this movement, in many ways, is not just about America. It is about a generation grappling with discomfort, disillusionment, and the search for meaning in a rapidly changing world. It reflects a deeper question. Are we trying to fix our circumstances, or are we trying to escape them? And that is where the real conversation begins. Because before you decide to leave a place, you have to ask yourself a more difficult question. Are you running towards something meaningful, or simply running away from something uncomfortable? Because if you don't understand that difference, no matter where you go, you may find that what you were trying to escape is already within you. When we move deeper into this conversation, we begin to see that much of the frustration fueling this movement is rooted in economic pressure. And to be fair, this is not imagined. For many people, the cost of living has risen in ways that feel overwhelming. Housing is more expensive. Healthcare is often seen as inaccessible. Education carries long-term financial burdens, and even basic necessities seem to demand more than they did a generation ago. So when people say, "I can't survive here anymore," we shouldn't dismiss that sentiment outright. There is a real struggle behind those words. But at the same time, we have to approach this issue with clarity, not just emotion. Because there is a difference between economic difficulty and economic impossibility. And one of the challenges of our time is that perception and reality are becoming increasingly blurred. When you are constantly exposed to narratives that emphasize crisis, inequality, and decline, your mind begins to interpret your situation through that lens. Everything feels heavier, more restrictive, more hopeless than it might objectively be. Part of this comes from comparison. People are looking at lifestyles in other countries, lower rent in one place, cheaper healthcare in another, a slower pace of life somewhere else, and they begin to construct an image of a world where everything is easier. But what is often missing from that picture is the full context. Lower costs may come with lower wages. Simpler systems may come with fewer opportunities. Stability in one area may require sacrifice in another. Every society has its trade-offs, and those trade-offs are rarely visible in short clips or viral posts. There is also a deeper psychological element at play. When individuals feel financially strained, it doesn't just affect their wallets. It affects their sense of dignity, control, and self-worth. Money, in many ways, becomes tied to identity. So when the system feels like it's working against you, it's not just frustrating, it feels personal. And that emotional weight can push people toward extreme conclusions, including the belief that leaving entirely is the only solution. But we have to be careful not to confuse discomfort with dysfunction. A system can have flaws, and every system does, without being entirely unlivable. The question is not whether challenges exist, but how we interpret and respond to them. Are we adapting, learning, and finding ways to navigate the system? Or are we allowing the pressure to define our reality completely? It's also important to recognize that expectations have shifted dramatically. There was a time when success was measured by stability, a steady job, a modest home, a predictable life. Today, success is often defined by freedom, flexibility, and fulfillment. And while these are valid aspirations, they are also harder to achieve consistently. When reality doesn't meet these elevated expectations, disappointment can feel like failure, even when one's situation is relatively stable by global standards. This is where perspective becomes essential. If you step outside the bubble of comparison and look at the broader global picture, you begin to see that what is considered struggle in one context might be seen as opportunity in another. That doesn't invalidate anyone's hardship, but it does challenge us to think more critically about what we define as unbearable. And ultimately, this brings us to a crucial realization. Economic pressure is real, but the narrative we build around it determines how we respond. If we see it as a signal to grow, adapt, and rethink our approach, it can become a catalyst for resilience. But if we see it only as proof that everything is broken, it can lead us toward decisions driven more by frustration than by clarity. Because at the end of the day, the question is not just whether a place is expensive or difficult. The question is whether we are willing to understand the full picture before we decide to walk away from it. And if we fail to do that, we may discover too late that we didn't escape a problem. We simply misunderstood it. When people begin to feel overwhelmed by their environment, one of the most powerful ideas that takes root in the mind is the belief that somewhere else must be better. It is a deeply human thought, and on the surface, it seems logical. If a system feels stressful, expensive, or limiting, then naturally the mind searches for alternatives. And in today's world, that alternative is often imagined as another country, another life waiting just beyond the border, free from the struggles you currently face. This is where the illusion of a better life elsewhere begins to form. Not because other places are perfect, but because distance creates fantasy. When you are far away from a place, you don't experience its daily friction. You don't deal with its bureaucracy, its cultural adjustments, its social isolation, or the slow process of rebuilding your identity in a new environment. You only see the surface, the highlight version of reality. And this is where many people unconsciously fall into a psychological trap. They assume that their problems are location-based, when in reality, Many problems are life-based, meaning they are attached to being human, not being in a specific country. Stress, financial pressure, loneliness, uncertainty, and comparison do not automatically disappear when you change geography. They often reappear in new forms, adapted to a new environment. Migration itself is not the issue. People move across the world for better opportunities, safety, and growth. And that is part of human history. The issue is the motivation behind the move. When the primary driver is escape rather than purpose, the foundation becomes unstable. Because escape is emotional, but building a life is structural. Escape reacts to discomfort, but building requires patience, discipline, and long-term thinking. We also need to be honest about what is rarely discussed in online narratives. Moving to another country is not a simple upgrade. It is a complete reset. You are not just changing scenery. You are often rebuilding your identity from the ground up. Your social network resets. Your sense of belonging resets. Even your confidence can temporarily collapse as you navigate unfamiliar systems where you are no longer an insider, but a learner again. And yet, in digital spaces, this complexity is often removed. What remains is a simplified message. I left, and my life became better. But what is missing is the middle chapter. The struggle, the adaptation, the loneliness, and the time it takes before stability even begins to return. Human beings are naturally drawn to conclusions, not processes. We see the result, but we rarely see the cost. There is also a deeper philosophical issue here. The belief that elsewhere is better can become an endless pattern. If satisfaction is always tied to location, then no location will ever feel final. Because the mind that is unsettled in one place will eventually become unsettled in another. The external environment keeps changing, but the internal restlessness remains untouched. This is why many people who move with the expectation of permanent relief eventually find themselves asking the same questions again. Is this really it? Is there somewhere better than this too? And slowly, the cycle repeats. Not because the world is always disappointing, but because expectation was never aligned with reality. True clarity comes when a person realizes that improvement is not only geographic, it is also internal. A change in environment can open doors, but it cannot replace the need for direction, meaning, and emotional grounding. Without that, even the best opportunities feel incomplete. So the real question is not simply, where should I go? But rather, what am I actually trying to solve within myself? Because if that question is never answered, then every destination will eventually become temporary. And in the end, you may discover that the most important journey was never about leaving one place for another. It was about understanding what you were running from in the first place. When we continue this discussion, we cannot ignore one of the most powerful forces shaping modern perception: media influence and online narratives. In previous generations, people formed their understanding of the world through lived experience, direct communication, and slower channels of information. Today, however, perception is largely shaped through screens, through algorithms that decide what we see, what we feel, and even what we fear. And this is important to understand. The issue is not simply that information exists. The issue is how that information is curated and consumed. Most people are not seeing reality as a whole. They are seeing fragments of reality, carefully selected, emotionally charged, and repeated until they feel like the full picture. And when you consume enough fragments, your mind naturally begins to believe that the fragment is the reality. This is where online narratives become extremely powerful. A single video of someone expressing frustration, leaving a country, or claiming they found a better life elsewhere can reach millions within hours. And because it is presented in a personal, emotional format, it feels authentic. It feels trustworthy. But what we often fail to ask is this representative, or is it simply compelling? The modern digital ecosystem rewards intensity, not accuracy. It rewards content that provokes emotion, anger, hope, frustration, escape. So naturally, narratives that emphasize leaving, escaping, or starting over tend to spread faster than nuanced discussions about complexity, adaptation, or long-term struggle. Over time, this creates an imbalance in perception. The loudest stories begin to feel like the most common stories. And this has a subtle but profound psychological effect. When you are repeatedly exposed to content that suggests people are leaving and thriving elsewhere, your brain begins to normalize that idea. Even if your personal experience does not fully align with it, the constant repetition creates a sense of possibility that starts to feel like probability. This is how narratives reshape belief, not through argument, but through exposure. There is also another layer to this. Many online creators are not necessarily lying, but they are filtering. They share the outcome, not the process. They show the highlight, not the hardship. And because audiences rarely see the full journey, they unconsciously assume that the transition was smooth, direct, and universally positive. But in reality, most meaningful life changes are messy, slow, and filled with uncertainty that does not make it into short-form content. We also have to acknowledge the role of comparison culture. Social media does not just show you other lives, it places them next to yours in real time. You are no longer observing someone else's success from a distance. You are seeing it while sitting in your own reality, often during moments of struggle or fatigue. This creates an emotional distortion where your ordinary day feels like failure, and someone else's curated moment feels like truth. And slowly, without realizing it, this shapes decision-making. People begin to make life-altering conclusions based not on complete information, but on emotionally charged snapshots. The desire to get out becomes less about a rational evaluation of systems and more about an emotional response to curated realities. But here is where we need intellectual honesty. If your understanding of a complex issue is primarily shaped by short videos, viral posts, and algorithm-driven content, then your conclusion will always be incomplete. Not necessarily wrong in feeling, but incomplete in understanding. This does not mean media is inherently harmful. It means it must be consumed with awareness. Because when narratives are not questioned, they quietly begin to guide decisions that feel personal, but are actually influenced. So the deeper question becomes, are we interpreting reality, or are we absorbing someone else's interpretation of it? Are we thinking independently, or are we slowly aligning our beliefs with the most repeated voices in our digital environment? And if we do not pause to ask that question, we may find ourselves making decisions not based on truth, but based on repetition. Because in the end, the most influential force is not what you see once. It is what you see repeatedly until you start to believe you thought of it yourself. When we step back from individual experiences and media narratives, there is another layer that we have to confront honestly: the role of privilege, perspective, and global comparison. This is often the most uncomfortable part of the conversation because it forces us to zoom out from our personal frustration and place it within a much larger human context. A person living in the United States, even when struggling, is operating within a global system that still offers a level of infrastructure, mobility, and opportunity that a large portion of the world does not have access to. This is not a statement meant to dismiss anyone's hardship. Struggle is still real, pressure is still real, and anxiety is still real. But struggle exists on a spectrum, and that spectrum is something we often forget when we are deeply immersed in our own environment. What tends to happen is that people evaluate their lives not against global reality, but against local expectations. And those expectations are constantly rising. What was once considered stable is now considered average. What was once considered successful is now considered insufficient. And because expectations move faster than conditions improve, there is a growing emotional gap between what people have and what they believe they should have. This gap is where dissatisfaction grows. Now, when individuals begin to look at other countries, especially through the lens of online content or selective comparisons, they often see one side of the equation: lower rent, simpler lifestyles, slower pace of life, or stronger cultural cohesion. And compared to their current stress, this appears attractive. But what is often missing is the structural context that supports or limits those advantages. Every country operates with trade-offs. Some places may offer lower costs but fewer economic opportunities. Others may offer strong safety nets but limited upward mobility. Some may provide community stability but restrict personal freedom or professional diversity. And these trade-offs are not always visible when you are looking from the outside. But more importantly, there is a psychological shift that happens when people compare themselves only to what they see online or to idealized versions of other societies. They begin to develop what we can call selective dissatisfaction, meaning they are no longer evaluating their life as a whole. They are isolating specific discomforts and amplifying them against idealized alternatives. And this is where perspective becomes critical. Because when you expand your frame of reference beyond your immediate environment, your understanding of difficulty and opportunity begins to recalibrate. What feels like limitation in one context may actually be seen as privilege in another. What feels like struggle in one place may be considered stability somewhere else. But again, the goal here is not to invalidate personal experience. The goal is to restore balance to perception. Because without balance, decision-making becomes emotionally driven rather than reality-driven. And emotionally driven decisions, especially life-altering ones like migration, often overlook long-term complexity in favor of short-term relief. There is also a deeper philosophical issue at play. Human beings have a natural tendency to normalize their environment. What we live in every day becomes invisible, while what we observe from a distance becomes idealized. This is why people who leave a place often begin to romanticize it later, and people who stay begin to criticize it more intensely. Neither view is fully objective. They are both shaped by distance and emotion. So when we talk about privilege, we are not just talking about wealth or comfort. We are talking about the ability to access opportunities, to recover from mistakes, and to operate within systems that, despite their flaws, still offer pathways for growth. And when that is not acknowledged, frustration can become distorted into a belief that everything is broken, when in reality, it may be more complex than that. The real intellectual challenge, then, is to hold two truths at the same time: that real problems exist, and that those problems exist within a broader context that is often overlooked. Maturity is not choosing one over the other. It is learning to see both without letting either one distort your judgment. Because if we lose that balance, we risk making decisions not based on truth, but on emotional comparison. And comparison, when left unchecked, rarely leads to clarity. It leads to dissatisfaction that has no endpoint. And in the end, the question is not whether your life is perfect or imperfect. The question is whether your perspective is wide enough to see your life as it truly is, rather than as a reaction to what you briefly see in others. When we bring all of this together, we arrive at the deeper question that sits beneath the surface of this entire movement. After we talk about economic pressure, media influence, global comparison, and the illusion of better alternatives, we are left with something more fundamental: the internal condition of the individual. Because at the end of the day, movements like Get Out of America are not just political or geographical reactions, they are psychological expressions. They reveal something about how people are interpreting discomfort itself. So the real question becomes this: is the issue truly the environment, or is it the way the environment is being experienced? There is a very important distinction here. External conditions matter. No one is denying that. Systems can be improved, policies can be debated, and societies can evolve. But the internal lens through which we interpret those conditions plays an even greater role in shaping our sense of reality. Two people can live in the same place, under the same system, and experience it in completely different ways. Not because the system changed, but because their mindset, expectations, and emotional resilience are different. This is why escape often feels like a solution, but rarely functions as one. Because escape is based on the assumption that discomfort is located outside of you. That if you remove yourself from the environment, you remove the problem. But human experience is not that simple. You carry your fears, your expectations, your unresolved frustrations, and your patterns of thinking wherever you go. Geography can change your surroundings, but it does not automatically restructure your inner world. And this is where many people quietly encounter the same realization after making major life changes. The initial excitement of a new environment slowly settles, and the same questions begin to reappear. The same stress patterns resurface. The same comparisons return. The same sense of, "Is this enough?" starts to echo again. Not because the new place is identical to the old one, but because the internal framework interpreting it has not changed. We also need to recognize something about modern expectations. Today, people are not just looking for stability. They are looking for emotional alignment with their environment. They want their surroundings to feel consistently comfortable, fulfilling, and validating. But life, by its very nature, does not operate that way. Every system, every society, every phase of life includes friction. Growth itself requires discomfort, and a life without challenge is not a realistic expectation. It is an emotional ideal. So when individuals respond to frustration by seeking a completely new environment, what they are often seeking is not a different country, it is a different feeling. Relief, clarity, control. But these are internal states, not geographical ones. And when internal states are not developed, external changes can only provide temporary relief, not lasting transformation. This is why the deeper work is not simply about deciding where to go, but understanding how you process where you are. Do you interpret difficulty as a signal of failure, or as part of a broader process of adaptation? Do you see obstacles as evidence that something is wrong, or as evidence that you are being challenged to grow? These questions matter more than the destination itself, because they determine whether your response to life is reactive or reflective. And that difference shapes everything, from your decisions to your sense of peace. At its core, this entire conversation is not really about leaving a country. It is about confronting a mindset that believes relief is always somewhere else. And that belief, if left unexamined, can quietly follow a person across borders, across systems, and across entire lifetimes. So the final reflection is simple, but uncomfortable. Are you trying to change your life by changing your location, or are you willing to change your life by changing your understanding of it? Because if the inner lens remains unchanged, even the best environment will eventually feel incomplete. But if the inner lens is transformed, even imperfect circumstances can become meaningful, manageable, and clear. And that is the real turning point. Not in where you go, but in how honestly you are willing to see what is already in front of you, and what is already within you.